Finally, we turn our attention to the idea of ethnic war and the more contemporary cases of genocide that we might find in the Balkans or Rwanda. And certainly there's a contrast we could begin to draw between these more contemporary instances and the Holocaust itself, in the sense that the same industrial and bureaucratic organization of slaughter that we saw in the Holocaust is not as obvious in these cases. We see there a much closer intimacy of killing that might involve systematic rape, cruel and humiliating violence directed at individuals, sometimes individuals who were familiar, who were neighbors. And so the anonymity and the facelessness of Jewish victims and their dehumanization or abstraction made possible by bureaucracy is not necessarily as obvious here, and hence perhaps the way in which the term of ethnic war comes to prominence. But what they do have in common is that they can also be understood as extreme forms of identity politics. But here again, we have to be attentive to the particular or particularly modern constructions of identity that are at play. One mistake would be to see these conflicts as the unavoidable product of ancestral identities, or as an atavistic, regressive propensity to genocidal violence among these cultures. In other words, this is simply what these peoples do. In fact, collective ethnic identities are not primordial ancestral forms of identification, but in large part modern constructions. So for John Bowen, ethnicity is a product of modern politics. Of course, people have always had identities that may have been derived from their religion, their birthplace, their language, and so on. The culture, any society that has culture, and all societies have culture, of course, have some form of identity that comes with that. But it is only very recently, in the modern period, the period of colonization and state building, that that individuals have started to see themselves as members of vast ethnic groups, opposed to other such groups. We could see this, for instance, in the case of Rwanda and the colonial experience of that part. Again, bearing in mind, and this is why I've put this map up here from 1813 from John Thompson. This is a map of Africa, and what we see is that in the early 19th century, large parts of Africa are described as unknown parts. Some of the coastlines are reasonably well known, but the inland is entirely unmapped, and there is no real understanding or familiarity with the peoples there. And yet, by the end of that same 19th century, the entire or large parts of the African continent would be under colonial rule. So one of the things that occurred in the context of colonization here, and again we'll talk specifically about Rwanda, but in some cases the policies apply much more broadly, is that the colonialists often implemented colonialism with relatively few troops or boots on the ground, if you want to use a common parlance, and did so through the relays of local power structures, co-opting, if you want, local elites. And so one of the things that happened in what at the time was referred to as Belgian Congo, as the first colonialists were the Belgians, was the ways in which local tribal identities, but you have to understand these identities were much looser and much more ill-defined than they would become. These tribal identities were effectively hardened and racialized by the Western colonizers. So in the Rwandan context, this involved making a distinction between Hutus and Tutsis. Tutsis were effectively the dominant local group, and they were made as the local administrators of Belgian Congo. But in fact, the distinction between Hutus and Tutsis was a very limited one. The group spoke the same language, shared many common traditions, and often was more a reflection of social rank than it was of any ethnic identity. And yet, the lens that the Western colonized imposed this was very much through the prism of the racial thinking that I've already discussed, which meant that the colonizers thought of the Tutsis as racially superior. They reasoned that these Tutsis were the local elites because they were closer, racially speaking, to Europeans. As a result, this involved producing or inscribing identities in a very rigid fashion. Individuals were identified as either Hutus or Tutsis. And indeed, one of the ways this was introduced was through the use of identity cards. Identity cards, of course, very common, not in the UK, but very common across the world and in European societies. But these forms of identification were first deployed in a colonial context. It's only one example, in fact, of the ways in which certain technologies of governance are first implemented in colonial context and then returned to the metropolitan areas. What these identity cards would identify is not merely the name and the date of birth of the individual, but clearly mark them as with an ethnic identity. And as I said, in many cases the distinction was a very artificial one. Intermarriage, cultural and linguistic similarities meant that distinguishing Hutus and Tutsis was quite difficult. In fact, what often happened is that poor Tutsis became Hutus, wealthy Hutus became Tutsis. Now, the legacy of this was that when Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the Hutus, who were the larger demographic group, acquired political power. And the legacy of the colonial period would live on, notably through long-standing resentment of the Hutus against the Tutsis, who consequently became scapegoats for any of the country's ills. After years of political instability and a civil war in the early 1990s, the shooting down of the Hutu president's plane in 1994, for reasons that still remain to be elucidated or fully elucidated, all of this led to the outbreak of genocide. To be clear, this genocide was not a spontaneous act of killing. It was very meticulously planned and organized by the state that mobilized militias and made use of radio communications to diffuse propaganda and instructions for the pursuit of killing. And here we have a map of the Rwandan genocide, which resulted in, over the course of a few months in 1994, in the death of around 800,000 Tutsis. Again, we can also understand this killing in the context of modern conditions of modern societies, notably through anxieties over identity in an increasingly globalized world, where state and national forms of identification are seen to be undermined. One could speak of a craving of atomized and isolated individuals for the recovery of some form of organic community. Think about the ways in which, in recent years, slogans and ideas such as America First or Brexit have prospered, and very often with the idea of reinvigorating some form of a national community in the face of alien forces of globalization. And while this does not necessarily lead to genocide, insecurity over identity is a driver of ethnocidal violence when it ends up seeking to purify the community and restore a sense of wholeness in this fashion. Now, of course, one of the questions that arises is that if generalized conditions of modernity and globalization are implicated in genocide, why does genocide happen relatively rarely? Why is it not a more common occurrence? Well, here we may need to turn our attention to the more opportunistic and strategic dimensions of genocide that we find in the work of someone like Valentino. That is to say, the idea that mass killing can also be something that's deployed or realized through political opportunism. That political leaders channel social forms of anxiety and group uncertainty in order to advance their narrow political interests. The Yugoslav case is instructive, I think, in this regard. Yugoslavia had undergone a complex history as a state created in the aftermath of the First World War. As in the Second World War, a country divided where Croatians allied themselves with the Nazi occupiers, pursued what by many accounts would be acts of genocide against Serbian populations in the war period, a context that undoubtedly informs subsequent Serbian thinking about these issues and legitimized in their eyes certainly actions against Croats and Bosnians in the 1990s. But to the point, to speak to the question of political opportunism, one of the things we could note here is the ways in which, in the early 1990s, the Yugoslav government lost one of its important forms of legitimacy, perhaps its primary form of legitimacy, with the end of the Cold War. So the ways in which the Yugoslav government, particularly under its primary leader Tito, had governed in the aftermath of the Second World War and to some extent repressed the conflict of the war period, was through an invocation of communism and socialist ideals, that all the groups within Yugoslavia were Yugoslavs and were brought together by a common socialist ideology. The collapse of the Cold War, of course, and the end of communist governance around the world meant that the existing elites in Yugoslavia could no longer legitimize their position through the appeal to communism or socialism. And the way in which it played out is that most of these, certainly the elites that benefited from this, did so by playing their respective ethnic cards. So that leaders from the Croat communities advanced Croatian interest, and likewise in Serbia and so forth. And so in many ways there was a political opportunism here that was realized by leaders who had all formerly been members of the Communist Party, presenting themselves as the defenders of their respective ethnic groups, which of course set the stage for the Balkan Wars eventually. This is what prompts Müller to talk about the banality of ethnic war, kind of riff on Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, which is to say that rather than a war of all against all, ethnic war, as seen in the Balkans or Rwanda, is often the product of the actions of small organized groups, typically made out of elements of the military, paramilitary gangs, and opportunistic criminals, operating with the complicity of political leaders, but often with limited ideological motivation of their own. A good example of this would be the individual here on the left, known as Arkan. Now, Arkan was a Serb career criminal. He had been on Interpol's most wanted list in the 1970s and 80s. Not a particularly political actor, but turned paramilitary leader during the Balkan Wars, and participated in some of the most vicious ethnic killings of that conflict. He was posthumously indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And so Arkan would be emblematic of these kinds of opportunists, these individuals that are not particularly ideological, but who profited from particular circumstances and did so with the cover of political leaders who were also following their own interests. So, therefore, I think we can, in a sense, approach an understanding of the causes of genocide that might be that might have really two facets to it. On the one hand, genocide seems to be grounded in some structural conditions, the particular conditions of modernity, and more specifically the heightened tensions and malaise over identity that can, under certain circumstances, make radical solutions appear palatable, even when these radical solutions involve the killing of another group. But simultaneously, it may also be that these structural conditions can only really lead to genocide when particular key actors and groups act upon these tensions. That in many cases, most individuals will stand by or comply with the demands of activist groups, and therefore that we have both structural conditions as well as key individual actors seizing on these circumstances in order for genocide to be realized. Perhaps the ultimate lesson to be drawn here is that genocide is most likely a latent, if thankfully rare, potentiality among all societies, and that rather than being an irrational throwback to pre-modern barbarity, is in fact profoundly related to conditions of modern historical experience.